Welcome to The Link Online. And we're live on Facebook once again, and also on the RCI website. And we have our regular team with us once again. We have Lynn Desjardins.
Hello, everyone.
Smiling brightly. It must be sunny outside, isn't it?
Yes, it is.
For a change, although still kind of cool. And speaking of cool, Mr. Cool, Levon Savant.
Cool himself. Hello there.
And on keyboards, once again, Marie-Claude Simard.
Hi, everybody.
And in the control room, smiling sweetly herself, is Chantal Saint-Sauveur. Yeah, look at that. See, if only you could see that. Nice big smile there. We have a lot of interesting things coming up on the show for you today. For example, Levon, what do you have?
I'll speak to a park manager in Arctic Canada who recently organized an igloo building workshop.
Well, I'll have some bad news for people with seasonal allergies in Canada and the rest of the world, too. Climate change is making things worse.
And I'll be speaking to a retired general about his new book on the war in Afghanistan, and especially the biggest battle there of September 2006. It was called Operation Medusa. Marie-Claude?
Well, I'll be talking to you about our long formats, our in-depth reports that will be coming out tomorrow.
All right. And I detect a bit of food there. So
Yeah, and there is food, too.
We're eagerly waiting that part of the show. That's all coming up, along with a couple of letters that you've posted to our website this week on The Link Online. We're going to start out with a story about a new book that's come out. Now retired Canadian Major General David Fraser in 2006 headed up the Canadian and NATO forces in southern Afghanistan, in the area which had seen the greatest level of conflict from Taliban attacks and hidden bombs. The Canadian mandate when they were sent over there was to help rebuild the country, establish security, and as needed, fight the Taliban, in that order. But the Canadians were thin on the ground, and the Taliban knew that. And in summer of 2006, word came that the Taliban were going to organize a major military-style attack with hundreds of fighters, and they would attempt to take control of the Panjwai district and push the Canadians and NATO out, and eventually, I suppose, take over the capital and the country. General Fraser then planned for his own operation to prevent that. It was called Operation Medusa. And in the end, the Canadian-led operation stopped the Taliban from achieving their objectives and set their plans back for over a decade. The battle tragically included another incident where American jets again mistakenly fired on Canadians, killing one and seriously wounding 30 others. General Fraser notes that operation was not without other frustrations as well, as we'll hear in this excerpt.
Everybody was working together to help out the other person.
Well, in the book you mentioned it also, a little bit of a conflict, I guess you'd call it that, about the various NATO forces, some of whom were perhaps less committed. And of course, you have this NATO organization. You are the commander of this organization with several countries, and they all have sort of different ROEs, rules of engagement. That must have caused a little bit of friction.
That was perhaps the biggest surprise about NATO, because the NATO is attack on one, it's an attack on all. Everyone's supposed to come to the show and support each other. The reality is not so much. And that's got nothing to do with the men and women on the ground, because, I mean, I had people from certain countries that were crying in front of me because their nations had said they're not going to come and participate. Nations played the red card, who's saying we can't participate, the risk is too high. Other nations, I called them pink cards, where in fact today I can do ABC, tomorrow I'll do AB. It was frustrating. It was complicated, and it really constrained what we were able to do.
Now, when you talk about this fight, there was a story written by Adam Day. Perhaps you could just read the paragraph here, what Adam Day wrote about the Canadians in battle.
They've been to a place beyond the normal world. They've seen their friends lying wounded on the ground, seen them die, and they've seen their own death. It was right there in the rockets flying by and the end of everything. It's a place without illusion, a place where fear and courage are the same thing, live or die. You do your own duty or you don't. It's a place from which any return is difficult. Don't feel sorry for them. They don't want that. They are professional warriors, and the first thing the men of Charles' company want you to know about the Battle of Objective Rugby is that they didn't lose. Not on that day, not on the mission. The attack failed, and it was a bloody chaos. Yes, but the task force kicked a mighty amount of Taliban ass that day. The enemy were lined up, hidden, hundreds of them firing from three sides, and the Canadians went forward despite all. They faced up, and when went into the guns, into the rockets, they attacked.
What does that do for you reading that?
Well, that's absolutely true. I mean, Charles Company went in that on the 3rd of September into a prepared defensive position, which we knew. We had been shelling them. Our artillery preparations, much like history has shown us, has limited effects, and it really comes down to the fighting spirit of the men and women who are doing the attack. They got beaten the first day. The second day, they took tremendous casualties from friendly fire. But on the day that we took Objective Rugby, Charles Company, what was left of them, were there. They stepped onto that objective, and they showed the Taliban, they showed everybody, including themselves, they were not defeated, but they defeated the Taliban.
You've also said that we weren't in Afghanistan to win. We were just there not to lose, kind of thing. What do you mean by that?
The idea of a military success, a military victory, is something that is perhaps, its day has gone by. The last time we did that, World War II, you might say, if you think about Wellington and Napoleon, but today, militaries just actually buy time so that a peace settlement can happen. And so what Operation Medusa was, it was not to lose, was just to push the yardsticks down. And what we did was the Taliban changed their behavior. They changed it again after Medusa. They've never fought like that before since then. And what we have done is contributed to the fact that in 2018, the Afghans are now talking about a peace process that's inclusive of the Taliban. That was our job, is to get us to that point where we could find a political solution.
And that was an excerpt of my conversation with retired Major General David Fraser on his new book, Operation Medusa, The Furious Battle That Saved Afghanistan from the Taliban. And the full interview is, of course, elsewhere on our website. In Afghanistan, and I guess things are still pretty rough there, though.
Yeah, well, it pushed, I guess... You're right. It pushed things 10 years down the road. We're in a situation now where the Taliban are appearing in areas, for example, in northern Afghanistan, where they weren't very active until very recently. So it's a constantly changing situation. But the other surprising thing is that the Afghan government has held on much longer than most people anticipated.
Well, as he said, they are negotiating now with the Taliban for some kind of power-sharing type of deal, so we'll see where that goes. Still more to come on the program here on The Link Online. Okay, we're going to talk about allergies, and this is a time of year for Canadians who suffer from seasonal allergies. About 30%, this is surprising to me, 30% of people in Canada are affected, and that is one of the highest rates in the world. And allergists say that climate change is going to make things worse for them. And Lynn, you looked into this.
Oh, it's already making things worse. I'm one of those people, actually, who suffer from symptoms such as sneezing, stuffed up or runny nose, cough, asthma. Go ahead, cough, Levon. And in my case, itchy eyes, that's the worst one. And it's all because of the pollen that is released from plant life, which is blooming at this time of year. Now, there are plenty of ways that global warming is changing the situation and, in fact, making things worse. And for details, I spoke with Dr. Mariam Hanna. She's an allergy specialist and professor at McMaster University in Ontario.
Can say here is that with global warming and climate change that we're seeing, there's been a huge effect on pollen seasons and pollen counts. So what we're seeing is that the growing season are consistently now longer, up to even a month longer from one year to the next. Pollen counts in a season are also seen to be higher. So birch pollen or ragweed pollen, which are quite common in different parts of Canada, are substantially higher during their seasons than they had been in the past. And it also seems now that we're seeing a rise in certain species of plants that never would have grown in a specific area or province and now can find those areas better to grow in and are so expanding their areas or territories.
What are you seeing in your clinical practice in terms of an increase in these allergies?
What I can say is that we're definitely seeing an increase in the number of patients that report seasonal allergies and do have confirmed seasonal allergies on testing. The severity of the allergies that affects most of our patients is increasing as well. And from my personal practice, I can tell you that the patient's age at first presentation is getting to be younger and younger. So these are little people that are starting to report seasonal allergies in addition to adults having new onset seasonal allergies or having progression in the severity of their symptoms.
How is the trend affecting children? How do you feel sorry for those little kids?
Well, a lot of what we see in children is that parents that have seasonal allergies are quick to recognize symptoms of it in their children. It's not just like the common cold where they get a runny nose and sneezing and stuffy for a couple of days. This goes on for weeks and even months sometimes. And so parents usually present with either a patient has a recurrent cold or a child has a recurrent cold, or maybe they do have seasonal allergies and their testing in the end confirms this. Kids can also have lots of breathing difficulties during pollen season, as can adults. We know that about 80% of people that have asthma, a pollen season can trigger asthma symptoms.
What should people do to reduce their exposure to these things?
You know, I can recommend a couple things. So if patients are specifically allergic to a pollen or think they might be allergic to that pollen, to try to limit their exposure as much as they can to the outdoors or to the elements when pollen counts are high. So that means keeping your windows closed, turning on your AC, changing your clothes when you come back in from outside. But usually when the weather is quite nice, it's pretty hard to tell people to stay inside. So for that, we have a number of over-the-counter medications that we like to recommend to people. Firstly, antihistamines that people know about. There's many different options that are available over the counter. There are nose sprays, saltwater rinses, eye drops that can be used quite safely. But if it continues, I really do recommend that people discuss it individually with their doctors, because at this point we have a number of very good medications that can be used to minimize the symptoms of seasonal allergies in the season. If you want something that's a bit more of a long-term option, though, I really do recommend for people to talk to their doctors about something called immunotherapy. And that's a way to try to build more long-term tolerance for pollen seasons in the future, not just the one season that they're experiencing the symptoms in.
So that's Dr. Mariam Hanna. She's an allergy specialist and Master at University in Ontario. And for all of you who do not have allergies, she reminded me that you can develop them at any time in your life.
Oh, yeah.
Interesting.
Yeah. It's very interesting because I remember distinctly that one of my first kind of cultural shocks in Canada was how many people here have allergies. When I was growing up in the former Soviet Union, we had a few people with allergies, but it was never as pervasive as here. It was amazing for me to see the number of people with allergies and like really serious allergies. I had no idea that peanut allergies exist, nut allergies exist. It's really something I'm wondering whether it has to do with the North American continent, or does it have to do with our food?
Yeah, there's some research that suggests that too clean an environment actually is a problem, and that if you live in an environment that is too clean, that your immune system responds to things that normally it wouldn't. There's some studies that talk about even parasites, that since our bodies never fight parasites because we live in a very clean environment, that they also have this immune response where they shouldn't. So, but there's a lot of research being done, and hopefully they'll make some kind of progress and make me feel better.
Yeah, I find the peanut allergy thing very strange because, like, you weren't here, back decades ago, but when I was growing up, there were whole years of young people that grew up on peanut butter and banana sandwiches or peanut butter and jam sandwiches. You'd go to the elementary school or high school lunchroom, and you'd have hundreds of kids, and there'd be hundreds of peanut butter sandwiches. And now you can't do that. You can't take anything with peanut butter in
Yeah,
school.
although allergists will tell you that they don't like those bans because then kids get a false sense of security. And the other problem is that there are all kinds of people who are just as deadly allergic to other substances. I know that my
Seafood,
daughter,
for example.
yeah, and my daughter was milk products. And so one day I sent her somewhere with nuts and they tried to take them away from her. And I said, fine, you can take the nuts away, but if you do that, then I'm going to demand that you also ban milk. And my friend will demand that you ban seafood and you ban this, that, and the other thing. So, I mean, really the kids, everybody has to be just a little more careful with the way they handle food, and the kids themselves have to be careful that they don't share food. It's a real problem, and it's a growing problem.
Well, it might be as you mentioned just a minute ago, is that we're too clean. I mean, when I was a kid, every kid was outside, were playing in the dirt and climbing trees and out, messing around and handling snakes and frogs and things.
They tell you now, let your kid eat dirt.
Yeah.
It's
Eat
a good
dirt.
thing. Yeah.
Well, on that note, we'll have some of your letters coming up. There's some nice gentle music there. Huh? How about that? Well, we have some of the comments you made to our stories this past week. And of course, as always, if you want to post a thought to a story, all our stories are open for public commenting, and they stay open. So that's why we sometimes get comments to stories that are 2 and 3 years old. We're going to start off with a comment today about Canada's announcing new measures to deal with asylum seekers. And Sue Zapel wrote this.
Enough is enough. There are too many crossing our border to Canada. It is made too easy for them to enter illegally into this country and is costing Canadians big on our taxes. This must stop. Enter legally or not be allowed to enter. A fence needs to be put up along the border. And that's her comment. I just wanted to add something there. Even if it were a good idea to put up such a fence, it would have to be 8,891 kilometers long, which is the length of the border between Canada and the United States.
Yeah, well, I think in this case they're talking about offensive on a fairly limited stretch, which is where we've talked about this. There's a road in the U.S. that comes up to the border, and it stops. And there's no road for several meters, and then another road starts on Canada's side, and there used to be a ditch there. All they had to do is cross the ditch. There was no fence or anything.
But we all know that if you close that one, that people will find another way around. So,
Anyway, all right. But, related to that story, there was another one called New Wave of Illegal Migrant Crossings into Canada. Bib wrote this.
Conservatives will form the new government of Canada soon and deal with this.
We'll see about that, I guess, eh?
Mr. Trudeau would certainly say it differently.
Yes, well. And on the same story, someone named Bruce also seems unhappy with the current situation regarding migrants crossing illegally into Canada.
Tax money down the drain. Trudeau is sure good at this.
All right. We had a story on a recent national survey about marriage in a study called Marriage, a Fading Concept for Canadians. In England, longtime web visitor Peter Ashcroft wrote this.
Marriage is a lifelong commitment by both parties and is essential when bringing up their children. It is saddening to hear about the increasing problems of single-parent family who has both childcare and income support responsibilities. This results in a heavy workload at all times.
And on a story put up on Friday about the record flooding in Canada, first in the east and now in the west, Ursula Wagner wrote this.
That is what climate change is like, and it is only the beginning, and it is worldwide, and we're still not able or willing to act accordingly, or even admit it.
And that's the time we have for comments for this week. Of course, once again, if you have a comment on any story, just scroll down to the very bottom of that story, and the form is there. Well, igloos, of course, have become one of the most iconic images of the Canadian Arctic. They're used in everything from advertising to children's cartoons. But for millennia, the Inuit people have used these dome-like structures built out of blocks of packed snow to shelter from the harsh northern elements. And last month, one of Canada's largest national parks organized an igloo building workshop. And Levon, you looked into that story.
Well, Mark, this workshop was organized by the Surmullic National Park. It's one of Canada's northernmost national parks. It's located in northeastern Baffin Island in Nunavut. And it was held in a small Inuit community called Pond Inlet. Dozens of people showed up, both local and visitors of the park, to learn this very ancient craft. For more on this, I spoke with the man who organized the workshop. His name is Kerry Elverum. He's the manager of the Surmullic National Park. He also took part in this workshop and learned to build igloos from one of the 3 elders who led it. The Inuit, of course, have been settled in these permanent communities, such as Pond Inlet, since at least 1950s. And they live in modern houses with all the modern amenities. And I wanted to know, why is it still important to know how to build igloos?
Igloos were the result of their Inuit incredible ingenuity in the land. And for Inuit living in such a harsh and unforgiving climate, the need to create an environmentally efficient structure with the resources at hand was paramount. They were essential for the survival while traveling on the land or sea ice. And the knowledge of how to build them was passed on down from generations and has allowed Inuit to thrive in Nunavut. Basically, the skill remains important today from both a cultural and safety perspective. So when you're traveling out on the sea ice for emergency purposes, people still need to know how to build an igloo. And also, it's one of those things from a cultural perspective, people really connect with that. It's part of their identity. It's important for them to be able to do that. In fact, Inuit today say that they can't get married unless the male Inuit can build an igloo.
Now, I have had some training with Canadian Rangers and had an Inuit elder show me how to build an igloo. Just maybe for people who have never seen how it's done, can you kind of describe the process?
One of the first things you have to be able to do is build a good solid snow block, and that is the key. So cutting out about 30 to 40 blocks of snow is the first step, and learning where to find the snow and what kind of consistency you're looking for is the first thing that we have to look at. So it takes about 30 to 40 snow blocks, and as I learned, you need a great deal of skill on cutting out those snow blocks. And once you've done that, they're assembled into a spiral pattern. The gaps are filled with snow, and for the most part, I learned is you need a lot of patience, and it was really helpful to have the Inuit elders there provide the knowledge to and show you how to build a sturdy and safe structure.
Mark, that was an excerpt of my conversation with Carrie. He is the manager of the Surmullic National Park, one of Canada's largest and northernmost national parks. And I spoke to him on the phone in Iqaluit, the capital of Nunavut. And
You have done this.
yes, I have done him. Actually, the photo of the gentleman in the beginning of the story, his name is Elijah. He was the same gentleman who taught. Very fortunate to go on one of these sovereignty patrols for our project, Eye on the Arctic, where I was doing a story about Canadian Rangers. And this gentleman, Elijah, taught a whole bunch of Canadian soldiers. There was an Australian soldier how to build igloos. And I was fortunate enough to not only build one, but actually live in an igloo while we were staying there. So
It's not as easy as the people think.
Oh my God, it's. First of all, you have to find that snow. It has to be of specific consistency. But I think the trickiest part is that you have to build it. It goes like a spiral and goes up and up and up and up and up until at the very end you have to put in this block that acts as a key and locks the dome.
It's got to be shaped.
It has to be shaped. It has to go on a certain angle, and it goes up until that last block you put in. And that kind of locks the structure.
The keystone.
The keystone, yeah. And it's amazing what difference it makes in terms of temperature. Because when we were there, it was like minus 35 outside. Inside the igloo, it was around minus 5, sometimes going up until almost 0. So
Toasty.
it's a
My goodness,
huge
yes.
difference. Like it's 30 degrees difference. It's from minus 35 to minus 5.
That sounds like the regular weather here.
I actually slept in an igloo in Nunavik.
Oh, really?
Did you sleep in your
Yes,
igloo?
yeah, of course.
So yeah, we also participated in one of those igloo building things. You know that Inuits have over 20 words for snow.
Yeah.
So that's why.
Got to
they-
get the right snow. Oh, I'm going to put this on my bucket list. Learn how to make an igloo.
And in terms of tools, all it takes is a saw.
Well,
And they have a long knife.
called a panook.
Yeah, yeah. It's a long, like machete-like knife, and that's all it takes.
I thought it was a piece of wood, a thin piece of wood they would use.
Well, I think in the old times they
the old
probably
times, yeah.
used a thin piece of wood or maybe a piece of bone or whalebone or something like that. But now it's a piece. It looks
Yeah.
like a like this
machete.
round machete.
Yeah, it's called a panook. P-A-N-U-C-K.
Okay.
Cool.
So,
All right. Now,
Wicked
moving on to
cool.
some other things. We some time ago, actually, we produced, all of us, sort of a documentary feature, and these have been sort of sitting around and ready to load.
yes, the RCI, Radio-Canada International, is launching its long formats this weekend.
And what do we-
every section is going to have one published this weekend starting Saturday, and it's going to be on also on Sunday. And the English section is going to start with a report that Mark and I co-signed, actually. It's about service dogs.
At the
So-
seeing eye dog. Look at
Yeah.
that! Look at that guy.
Wait a minute, I'm going to show our... because now I'm...
He's the star. He's beautiful. Certainly cuter than any of us, I think.
Here we go, I think. Okay, so people can see it. Yeah. So here it is. I have a little excerpt of the videos we actually made.
This is part of the longer documentary.
Yeah.
Comes to is that the dog and the handler wind up relying on each other for, in essence, survival and well-being. And that is a very powerful and very deep relationship that builds over time. And the way it works, essentially, is I'm better at certain things. You know, I know where we're going. I know when the light is green or red and a variety of things. And my dog knows about obstacles, knows about steps and many other factors. And we're both fallible, but we complete each other so that 99% of the time, come what may, we make it through.
I would say we're really
Do you want me to?
proud of to do this to people, to help people around us and make a difference. I think it's the
All right. There's a little segment of the long form documentary going on this weekend. That's the one that you and I did, and it's about making of service dogs. These are the seeing eye dogs and dogs for autistic children and so on and so forth. So that's coming up this weekend. Lynn, what was yours about? That'll be coming up like next weekend, for example.
Oh, I had a story about a young man who had suffered a stroke at a very young age, and he suddenly had a criminal charge against him, and we were trying to make sure he could get help in the court to testify because his speech was affected. And it was a long haul. You have to watch the piece to find out what happened.
But there was one important thing. He said if he didn't win,
Oh, yeah, he thought his life would be over.
yeah.
Yeah.
Levon, what's yours about?
Mine is about this very controversial monument in Canada to a Ukrainian nationalist leader who, during the Second World War, had collaborated with Nazis and is considered a national Ukrainian hero now. So it raises a lot of questions about history and how we interpret and reinterpret history and the role of different diasporas in.
Who is this guy?
His name is Roman Shukhevich, and he was the commander of the Ukrainian insurgent army, UPA. and he fought with the Germans, then against the Germans, and against the Soviets. And that last part is what made him a national hero in Ukraine. And there's a lot of people who are very unhappy that people are forgetting about his collaboration with the Nazis.
All right, so we'll look forward to that. That'll be in a couple of weeks. That's all the time we have for the show for today. So for Levant Savants and Lynn Desjardins and Marie-Claude Simard and our technician Chantal Saint-Sauveur, do take care. Is it this camera, Marie-Claude?
Yes, you forgot about the food.
Yeah, well,
I think we should extend the show.
Okay. We'll extend the show. Stay tuned next week for leftover food. Bye-bye.